Dutch language literature comprises all writings of literary merit written through the ages in the Dutch language, a language which currently has around 23 million native speakers. Dutch language literature is the produce of Netherlands, Belgium, Suriname, the Netherlands Antilles and of formerly Dutch-speaking regions, such as French Flanders, South Africa, and Indonesia. The Dutch East Indies, as Indonesia was called under Dutch colonization, spawned a separate subsection in Dutch language literature. Conversely, Dutch language literature was and is produced by people originally from abroad who came to live in Dutch-speaking regions, such as Anne Frank and Kader Abdullah. In its earliest stages, Dutch language literature is defined as those pieces of literary merit written in one of the Dutch dialects of the Low Countries. Before the 17th century, there was no unified standard language. The dialects that are considered Dutch evolved from Old Frankish. A separate Afrikaans literature started to emerge during the 19th century, and it shares the same literary roots as contemporary Dutch, as Afrikaans evolved from 17th century Dutch. The term Dutch literature may either indicate in a narrow sense literature from the Netherlands, or alternatively Dutch language literature. Until the end of the 11th century, Dutch literature, like literature elsewhere in Europe, was almost entirely oral and in the form of poetry. In the 12th and 13th century, writers started writing chivalric romances and hagiographies for noblemen. From the 13th century, literature became more didactic and developed a proto-national character, as it was written for the bourgeoisie. With the close of the 13th century, a change appeared in Dutch literature. The Flemish and Hollandic towns began to prosper and a new sort of literary expression began. Around 1440, literary guilds called Rederijkerskamers arose, which were usually middle-class in tone. Of these chambers, the earliest were almost entirely engaged in preparing mysteries and miracle plays for the people. Anna Bynes is an important figure who wrote in modern Dutch. The Reformation appeared in Dutch literature in a collection of psalm translations in 1540 and in a 1566 New Testament translation in Dutch. The best known of all Dutch writers is the Catholic playwright and poet Joost Van Den Vandal. During the late 18th and early 19th century, the Low Countries had gone through major political upheaval. The most prominent writers were Willem Bilderdijk, Hieronymus van Alphen, and Rijn Visveith. Piet Paaltjens is one of the very few readable 19th-century poets, representing in Dutch the romantic vein exemplified by Heine. A new movement called tachtigers, or movement of 80, after the decade in which it arose. One of the most important historical writers of the 20th century was Johan Huizinga, who is known abroad and translated in different languages and included in several great books lists. During the 1920s, a new group of writers who distanced themselves from the ornate style of the movement of 1880 arose, led by Nesho. During WW II, influential writers included Anne Frank died in a German concentration camp, as did crime fiction writer, journalist and poet Jan Kampert. Writers who had lived through the atrocities of the Second World War reflected in their works on the changed perception of reality. Obviously, many looked back on their experiences the way Anne Frank had done in her diary. This was the case with Het Bittere Kruid of Marga Minko, and Kinder Jaren of Dona Oberski. The renewal, which in literary history would be described as ontluister and realisme, is mainly associated with three authors: Gerard Reeve, W.F. Hermans and Anna Blayman. Old Dutch texts. Around 500 AD, Old Frankish evolved to Old Dutch, a West Germanic language that was spoken by the Franks and to a lesser extent by people living in the regions conquered by the Franks. Until the end of the 11th century, Dutch literature, like literature elsewhere in Europe, was almost entirely oral and in the form of poetry, as this helped troubadours remembering and reciting their texts. Scientific and religious texts were written in Latin, and as a consequence most texts written in the Netherlands were written in Latin rather than Old Dutch. Extant Dutch texts from this period are rare. In the earliest stages of the Dutch language, a considerable degree of mutual intelligibility with most other West Germanic dialects was present, and some fragments and authors can be claimed by both Dutch and German literature. Examples include the 10th century Wat in Donk Psalms, a West Low Franconian translation of some of the psalms on the threshold of what is considered Dutch, and the 12th century county of Loon poet Hendrik van Velck. The Leiden Willarum. The Leiden Willarum is the name given to a manuscript containing a Low Franconian version of the Old High German commentary on Song of Solomon by the German abbot Willaram of Ebersberg. Until recently, based on its orthography and phonology, the text of this manuscript was believed by most scholars to be Middle Franconian, that is Old High German, with some Limburgic or otherwise Franconian admixtures. But in 1974, the German philologist Willy Sanders proved in his study Der Leidener Willarum that the text actually represents an imperfect attempt by a scribe from the northwestern coastal area of the Low Countries to translate the East Franconian original into his local vernacular. The text contains many Old Dutch words not known in Old High German, as well as mistranslated words caused by the scribe's unfamiliarity with some Old High German words in the original he translated, and a confused orthography heavily influenced by the Old High German original. For instance, the grapheme less than z greater than is used after the High German tradition where it represents Germanic t shifted to ts. Sanders also proved that the manuscript, now in the University Library of Leiden University, was written at the end of the 11th century in the Abbey of Egmond in modern North Holland, whence the manuscript's other name Egmond Willarum. Heb aan Olive O'Gala. The oldest known poetry was written by a West Flemish monk in a convent in Rochester, England around 1100. Heb aan Olive O'Gala Nestes Bagunnen Hines Hikender Thuart Unbidden We Knew. According to Professor Luc de Grauwe, the text could equally well be Old English, more specifically Old Kentish, though there is no consensus on this hypothesis. At that time, Old Dutch and Old English were very similar. The Rhinelander Rhyming Bible. Another important source for Old Dutch is the so-called Rhinelander Rhyming Bible. This is a verse translation of biblical histories, attested only in a series of fragments, which was composed in a mixed dialect containing Low German, Old Dutch and High German elements. It was likely composed in northwest Germany in the early 12th century, possibly in Verden Abbey, near Essen. Middle Dutch literature. In the 12th and 13th century, writers started writing chivalric romances and hagiographies for paying noblemen. From the 13th century, literature became more didactic and developed a proto-national character. The primary audience was no longer the nobility, but the bourgeoisie. The growing importance of the southern Low Countries resulted in most works being written in Brabant, Flanders and Limburg. In the first stages of Dutch literature, poetry was the predominant form of literary expression. It was both in the Low Countries and the rest of Europe that courtly romance and poetry were popular literary genres during the Middle Ages. One Minnesanger was the aforementioned Van Velck, the first Dutch-language writer known by name, who also wrote epic poetry and hagiographies. The chivalric romance was a popular genre as well, often featuring King Arthur or Charlemagne as protagonist, as the political and cultural emphasis at the time lay in the southern provinces. Most of the works handed down from the early Middle Ages were written in southern Low Franconian dialects such as Limburgish, Flemish and Brabantic. The first Dutch-language writer known by name is Van Velck, who wrote courtly love poetry and epics. Beatrice of Nazareth was the first known prose writer in the Dutch language, the author of the 7 Ways of Holy Love. The Brussels friar Jan van Ruysbroek followed Beatrice in taking prose out of the economic and political realms and using it for literary purposes. He wrote sermons filled with mystic thought. A number of the surviving Dutch-language epic works, especially the courtly romances, were copies from or expansions of earlier German or French efforts. but there are examples of truly original works and even Dutch-language works that formed the basis for version in other languages. Another genre popular in the Middle Ages was the fable, and the most elaborate fable produced by Dutch literature was an expanded adaptation of the Reign of the Fox tale, Van den Vos Rhinelander, written around 1250 by a person only identified as Willem. Up until the 13th century, the Middle Dutch language output mainly serviced the aristocratic and monastic orders, recording the traditions of chivalry and of religion, but scarcely addressed the bulk of the population. With the close of the 13th century a change appeared in Dutch literature. The Flemish and Hollandic towns began to prosper and to assert their commercial supremacy over the North Sea, and these cities won privileges amounting almost to political independence. With this liberty there arose a new sort of literary expression. The most important exponent of this new development was Jacob van Melle, a Flemish scholar who worked in Holland for part of his career. His key works are Der Natuur en Bloem, a collection of moral and satirical addresses to all classes of society, and De Spiegel Historiel. Van Melle straddles the cultural divide between the northern and southern provinces. Up until now, the northern provinces had produced little of worth, and this would largely remain the case until the fall of Antwerp during the 80 Years' War shifted focus to Amsterdam. He is sometimes referred to as the father of Dutch poetry, a title he merits for productivity if for no other reason. Around 1440, literary guilds called Rederijkerskamers arose. These guilds, whose members called themselves Rederijkers or rhetoricians, were in almost all cases middle class in tone, and opposed to aristocratic ideas and tendencies in thought. Of these chambers, the earliest were almost entirely engaged in preparing mysteries and miracle plays for the people. Soon their influence grew until no festival or procession could take place in a town unless the chamber patronized it. The chamber's plays very rarely dealt with historical or even biblical personages, but entirely with allegorical and moral abstractions and were didactic in nature. The most notable examples of Rederijker theatre include Marike and Van Nieuwgen and Elkleach. At the close of the early period, Anna Bynes stands as a transitional figure. Bynes was an Antwerp schoolmistress and lay nun whose main targets were the faith and character of Luther. In her first volume of poetry, The Lutherans are scarcely mentioned and focus lies on her personal experience of faith. But in that of 1538 one finds sharp words for the Lutherans on every page. With the writings of Bynes, the period of Middle Dutch closes and the modern Dutch begins. Renaissance and the Golden Age. The first ripples of the Reformation appeared in Dutch literature in a collection of psalm translations printed at Antwerp in 1540 under the title of Zoeterliedekens. Very different in tone were the battle songs sung by the Reformers, the Gex songs. The famous songbook of 1588, Enkhuizen Liedboeken, was full of heroic sentiment. Philips van Marnix, Lord of Sint-Aldegond, was one of the leading spirits in the War of Dutch Independence and an intimate friend of William I, Prince of Orange. The lyrics to Wilhelmus van Nassau, the current Dutch national anthem and an apology of the prince's actions composed around 1568, are ascribed to Marnix. His chief work was 1569's Biankhof der Heilige Römische Kerke, a satire of the Roman Catholic Church. Marnix occupied the last years of his life in preparing a Dutch version of the Bible, translated directly from the original. At his death only Genesis was completed. In 1619 the Synod of Dort placed the unfinished work in the hands of 4 theologians, who completed it. This translation formed the starting point for the Statenvertaling or States' translation, a full Bible translation into Dutch ordered by the Synod, in order to be intelligible to all Dutchmen. The Statenvertaling included elements of all main Dutch dialects and so became the cornerstone of modern Standard Dutch. Dirk Volkits Zoon Cornelisz was the Low Countries' first truly humanist writer. In 1586 he produced his original masterpiece, the Zerdekunst, a philosophical treatise in prose. Cornelisz's humanism unites the Bible, Plutarch and Marcus Aurelius in one grand system of ethics. By this time, the religious and political upheaval in the Low Countries had resulted in 1581's Act of Abjuration, deposing their king, Philip II of Spain, and the subsequent 80 years' struggle to confirm that declaration. As a result, the southern provinces, some of which had supported the declaration, were separated from the northern provinces as they remained under Spanish rule. Ultimately, this would result in the present-day states of Belgium and the Netherlands. After Antwerp had fallen into Spanish hands in 1585, Amsterdam became the center of all literary enterprise as all intelligentsia fled towards the north. This meant both a cultural renaissance in the north and a sharp decline in the south at the same time. Regarding the level of Dutch literature practiced, the north received a cultural and intellectual boost, whereas in the south, Dutch was largely replaced by French as the language of culture and administration. In Amsterdam, a circle of poets and playwrights formed around Mecenas like Figaro Mavisha, which would eventually be known as the Muiderkring after the residence of its most prominent member, Peter Cornelisz Zoon Hooft, writer of pastoral and lyric poetry and history. From 1628 to 1642 he wrote his masterpiece, the Nederduitse Historien. Hooft was a purist in style, modeling himself after Tacitus. He is considered one of the greatest historians, not merely of the Low Countries, but of Europe. His influence in standardizing the language of his country is considered enormous, as many writers conformed themselves to the stylistic and grammatical model Hooft devised. Other members of his circle included Vischer's daughter Tesselschade and Gerbrand Adriaan Spradero, whose best-known piece is De Spaanse Brabander Geronimo, a satire upon the refugees from the south. A versatile poet loosely associated with the circle of Muiden was the diplomat Constantin Huygens, perhaps best known for his witty epigrams. Huygens' style was bright and vivacious, and he was a consummate artist in metrical form. The best known of all Dutch writers is the Catholic playwright and poet Joost Van Den Vandal, who mainly wrote historical and biblical tragedies. In 1625 he published what seemed an innocent study from the antique, his tragedy of Palamedes, or Murdered Innocents, but which was a thinly veiled tribute to Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, the Republic's Grand Pensionary, who had been executed in 1618 by order of Stadtholder Maurice of Nassau. Vandal became in a week the most famous writer in the Netherlands, and for the next 12 years, until the accession of Stadtholder Frederick Henry, had to maintain a hand-to-hand combat with the Calvinists of Dordrecht. In 1637 Vandal wrote of his most popular works on the occasion of the opening of a new Amsterdam theatre, Gisbrecht van Eemstal, a play on a local historical figure loosely modelled on material from the Aeneid that is still staged to this day. In 1654 Vandal brought out what most consider the best of all his works, the tragedy of Lucifer, from which it is said Milton drew inspiration. Vandal is considered the typical example of Dutch intelligence and imagination at their highest development. A similar school to that in Amsterdam arose in Middelburg, the capital of Zeeland, led by Jacob Cats. In Cats the genuine Dutch habit of thought, the utilitarian and didactic spirit reached its zenith of fluency and popularity. During early middle life he produced the most important of his writings, his didactic poems, the Meechtdenplicht and the Sinner en Minnebeelden. In 1624 he moved from Middelburg to Dordrecht, where he soon after published his ethical work, called Chivalric, and this was followed by an entire series of moral pieces. Cats is considered somewhat dull and prosaic by some, yet his popularity with the middle classes in the Netherlands has always been immense. As with contemporary English literature, the predominant forms of literature produced in this era were poetry and drama, Cornelisz and Hooft being the main exceptions. In another prose genre, Johann van Heemskerk was the leading man of a new vogue blown over from France, the Romance. In 1637 he produced his Batavische Arcadia, the first original Dutch romance, in its day extremely popular and widely imitated. Another exponent of this genre was Nicolas Heinsius the Younger, whose Mirandor resembles but precedes Les Iges Gil Blas. The period from 1600 to 1650 was the blossoming time in Dutch literature. During this period the names of greatest genius were first made known to the public and the vigor and grace of literary expression reached their highest development. It happened, however, that three men of particularly commanding talent survived to an extreme old age, and under the shadow of Vondel, Cats and Huygens sprang up a new generation which sustained the great tradition until around 1670, when decline set in sharply.